Okay, welcome to day 5 of JavaScript testing for beginners. Today we're going to talk about making a GitHub API request. We're going to check the stars out on a repo, and we're going to use spies and stubs. So what we're going to do first is we're going to hit the GitHub API with a GET request to get information about the stars, and we're going to pass through the owner and the repository name. We're going to use HTTP request with a callback. We're going to look at Sinon, and we're going to spy on the request. So this is still going to hit the API, but it's going to tell us some information about how it's been called. We're then going to use Sinon stubs to stub the HTTP request. So that's going to be, we're going to give it the data we want for our test back. And then we're going to do two things with what are called yields in Sinon. So we're going to be able to mock the data for a happy path and mock the data for our error conditions. So let's get started. Right, so I've created two new modules, day5.js in the source directory and day5.test.js in the test directory. Day5 is just going to be a new function. We're going to pass through the owner, a repository, and a callback, which is going to be called with our data. We're going to export it default as always. We're also going to import request from request, so we need to install that first. So npm install --save request. So here we're doing save rather than save dev because this is a production dependency, not a development dependency. We need this for our code to run. Then we're going to create our tests here. So we're going to need, as always, try Sinon and import the function that we need. And what I've done is that I've written two describe blocks because we're going to split them up into using spies and using stubs, and I'm going to show you both things. So what do we need to do with the GitHub repo API? Let's have a look. Okay, so this is the API. We call get repos with an owner, a repo. And for most cases, when it's our happy path and it does return something that gives us a 200 HTTP status code. And this is the data that it will return. Now, the only data we actually need is this Stargazer's count here. So a few things we need to know when using the GitHub API. So this is when you're writing your code, you'll look through the documentation. Here, we always need a user agent, so we're going to have to pass that in our headers. So our request needs a user agent, and we can just make our own user agent up. Also, the error conditions we need to know about. The main one here is going to be rate limiting. So we can put a test in for that, and we can check that we return this this message back and this 403 when we're rate limited. So we can add a test for that. Right then, let's get started with spies. Now, spies in Sinon wrap functions or objects and give you data back about how they were called. So let's set one up. We'll call it a spy request get. So we're going to use this to spy on the request HTTP client and its get method. So we're going to set that up before and after each test. We're going to create the spy and then restore it. So we did before each and set up our spy request get equals sinon.spy request, which we'll import in a minute. And we want the get method. And then after each test, we're going to restore that. If we don't restore it, it'll be left in a state where it's still being spied upon. So we need to make sure we do that. So let's import request now. Import request from request. And then let's set up our test. So I've done the two tests I'm going to do here. So firstly, we're going to do it should make a get request once. So we can check the number of times that the request is called, that a function's called. And then we're going to do it. Now here's a tip for Mocha. You can write the test name without any function, and that just skips the tests. So do should make request with expected URL. And we can leave that in that state until we're ready to write that test. So at the moment, if we run the tests, as always, Mocha require Babel register. And again, we can just choose the day 5 tests. At the moment, as you can see, one's skipped, so we've not written that test yet. This one's passed because there's no expectation in there. So let's put our expectations in. Now it's going to be asynchronous. So remember yesterday we said we needed the done function. So we can call day 5. We're going to pass through an owner, so express.js, a repo that we want to look at, we'll look at express, and then some callback. We're going to get it to call back with some data, and we're going to need to call done when our test is finished. So what do we want here? We want to check whether the spy has been called and how many times it's been called. So we can do expect spy request get. It has something on it called call count, so we can check the call count. And we can say, does that equal 1? Because we know that we're only going to call this once. So let's run that test again. It should time out because the callback's not been called in here. Okay, so let's write the code to pass this test. Right, so we're going to call the GitHub API. So let's create the URL for that. GitHub URL. And because we're passing through owner and repository, let's use some template literals from ES6 to create this URL. So it's api.github.com/repos. So that's the API we're going to call. We need to pass through the owner, and then we need to pass through the repository. Okay, so that gets us a URL. Then we need to create some request options. So we need the URL, that's passed as URI. The next thing we need to add are the headers. So remember before we said we needed user agent, otherwise our request will be unauthorized by the GitHub API. So we'll call it JavaScript testing for beginners. Doesn't really matter what that user agent is, but you need one. Two other things we can do with the request is we can say we want to resolve with full response. And if we set that to true, we'll get the whole response back. And we're expecting JSON, so we'll say we want JSON back. And that just means that request handles that in the background, so we don't have to do a JSON.parse. So how do we use request? We do request.get, pass in some request options. Oops. And then we have a callback. Now the callback takes the form of an error, a response object, and a body object. There we go. So what we're saying in our test is that should be called once. So we'll just call a callback for now with nothing. We'll pass an empty object back. But this will pass our test now, because this should be called once. Great stuff, it's called once. Remember what we said yesterday? So this is a spy. It's asynchronous, but it's actually calling the API, so hence it's taking nearly half a second there, 463 milliseconds. We don't really want that. For unit test, you wouldn't really want to spy on a GET request because it will actually make the GET request. We prefer a stub, so we'll use a stub in a minute. I'll show you how to refactor that. Let's make our second test and check that we are actually passing the expected URL. So obviously we're passing that as GitHub URL here in the request options. So one thing we can do with a spy or a stub is we can say, get the arguments we've passed to it, check one of the arguments, which is an object, and we can check the URI property on that. So let's do that test now. So again, it's asynchronous. And again, we need to call express.js. And we want to look at the express repo and the data we get back. So here, once I expect, we're going to look at spy request get again. Spy request get. Now we can use get call, and get call tells us the parameters used for this call. So we can look at its arguments, and the first argument passed through 0. It should be an object, and we can check the whole object if we want, but here we're just going to check the URI, so we'll do .uri. And then we expect it to equal. So what should it equal? Well, we've created it should be https api.github.com. So let's just create that hard-coded string, https api.github.com/repos. In our case, we've passed through express.js and the express project. We need to know that that's the correct URL, and then we need to call done because it's an asynchronous test. We need to say it's done. Let's try that now. And day is not defined because it's day 5. I'm a bit silly there. Perfect. Again, it's actually called the API, but we've confirmed that it is the correct URL. Okay, so let's think about refactoring these so they're actually fast tests. We can use Sinon stubs. So stubs are different than spies. They actually replace the methods that they stub rather than just looking at the methods they stub. So this means we can get the GET request to return whatever data we stub it with. So let's set up the stub now. So again, we'll do let stub request get. And again, we'll do it before and after each test. So it's set up and then cleaned up. If you're using things like stubs, you should always set them up before a test and then clean them up after the test. Otherwise, they can be left in a state where they're still stubbed. And in fact, Sinon will actually complain if you try and stub it twice. So we do before each, and we do stub request get equals sinon.stub this time, request, and we're going to stub the get method again. And then after each, again, we're going to clean it up with a restore, and that just unstubs it. So I've made 3 tests that we should write here. I've written comments for them. So again, we can do should make one request. We won't check the API URL because we've already done that. It's the same thing, but it's just stubbed instead. We're then going to check we return the correct data. So we're going to assume that the GitHub API has returned us valid data, and we'll check for that. Then we can check for tests. I've not spelled that correctly. We can check a test where we check for an error. So we can then stub the GitHub API with some error, and then we can confirm that we can handle the error correctly in our code. Okay, so let's write the test for these. So it should make one GET request. We can run that, and we can do it should return expected data. And lastly, we can say it should return expected data when when rate limited, because we'll specifically check for the rate limit. Okay, so if we run those tests, they should all just be skipped. Now, one thing that I've done wrong here is I've done after rather than after each. So after gets run after the whole of the test suite, everything inside this describe block. So you can do before, which is a function before. You can do after, which runs after all the tests. So this runs before the test suite. This runs after the test suite. This runs before each test. And this one runs after each test. So in this case, what I did incorrectly was I stubbed it before each test, but then didn't unstub it until after all of the tests have run. So let's try that now. There we go. That's much better. So all of our tests aren't running yet. So let's get them running. Again, this is asynchronous, so we're going to pass the mockers done function. Day 5, we're going to say express.js and the express repo. And we're going to expect data back. I'm going to call done when we're finished, and our expectation, like we did before, we can just copy this here. We're going to say it should be called once, and let's check that that now works. And as you can see, it's failed. So the reason it's failed now is because we've stubbed get, but we've not told it to return anything. So at the moment, it's not actually going to call our callback, so it times out. So let's fix that. So what we need to do is we need to do what's called yields. So we do stub request get.yields. Now what yields does is it attempts to find the first callback function in the thing you're stubbing. So in this case, it would be this function here. And we can tell it the data we want it to return. So in this case, we don't really care what the data is. So instead, we're just going to leave it like this as yields, because we're not going to actually check any data. So let's run the tests again. And I've incorrectly put, because I've cut and paste, which is why you should never cut and paste, I've incorrectly put spy there. Let's try that now. Perfect. Actually works. And we're just yielding there with no data. So now we actually want to check the data is returned as we expect it. So again, an asynchronous test, call day 5 with express.js and express repo. So the data we expect to get back now, we said we wanted the stars. So from our API, we're going to set up a given response. So we call it given API response. Now from the GitHub API, that's going to be Stargazer's count. So we're going to stub this. So we're going to say Stargazer's count. And this is what we would expect to get back normally from the GitHub API. We'll just say it's 100. Doesn't really matter what that is. And then when we come to check the data, we're going to change what's returned. So we're going to say to deep equal, because it won't be the same object as the object that's here. We're just going to call it stars, and we expect that to be the same as the given API response dot stargazer's count. Okay, great. So when we get in here, we need to say that the body that's returned is this API response. So let's tell the stub, we're going to yields. So we want no error. The response we get back, let's make this a little bit clearer, put it on multiple lines. The response we get back here has a status code in it, and that would be a 200 in this case because it's going to succeed, and that would be the given API response. So what we've done there is we've stubbed the API response. So this acts as the GitHub API, but we've just told it that this is what we're going to return. Now we could do the full GitHub response. In our case, we don't actually want all of it. The only thing we actually want from it is a Stargazer's count. So that's why we're not stubbing it all. You could load it from a fixtures file, a JSON fixtures file, and you could just import that in and use that as a response if you'd like a full response. In some cases, you should probably do that, especially for integration tests. In this case, we're just doing a minimal response and then testing that we get it. So let's see if that works now. Obviously, it doesn't. So we're expecting stars, but we've got this empty object because we haven't actually parsed it there. So we're going to say stars is our body dot stargazer's count. Let's try that now. Stargazers of undefined. Okay. So what's happened here? Great. So our test has actually passed. Should return expected data. But what's happened is the previous test has failed now. And why is that? Well, it's because in our previous test, we said we can just yield there. So sometimes it's what you need to do. You need to write another test and a previous test will fail. Then you need to set the new expectations with fake data. So in this case here, we're going to say that we're going to have null. We're going to have a status code of 200. And then we need some default data. So here we can say Stargazer's count is 1,000. There we go. So that's our default data. So the previous test should now work. There we go. So the final thing we're going to test here is we're going to test an error condition. So this is a great thing about stubs. You can set up either your happy path when the function under test is going to work, or you can set up error paths and you can see what happens with your code that you properly catch error conditions. Okay, so we're going to pretend that we're rate limited here. So again, we're going to call day 5 with express.js and express repo. We're going to expect some data back. And again, we would call done after we've finished. So what's our expectation here? Well, perhaps we want it to say that we've been rate limited in some way and give us some success code. So perhaps we say expect the data to deep equal. I'm going to set up an object here. So the success is false. Perhaps it returns as the error code as well. So we say status code is 403 in this case. and then we give it some error message. API is rate limited. Try again later. There we go. So that's what we expect to happen. Let's run the test, and it should fail. Okay, it times out. So in this case, again, we haven't actually returned a response, an error response. So let's do that. So what's the expected response? So I'm just going to cut and paste here. So that's the actual API response. It's a really long error message. It says API rate limit is exceeded for your IP address, etc. I'll cut that down. So it's roughly what you get back from the API, but we'll just cut it down because we don't need it all, but we just need this response. So what we should do is we should do our stub request again, and we need to yield. And in this case, we're going to have an error. So we're going to have a new error, API rate limit exceeded. What we're going to do is we're going to check the status code. So the status code here is a 403. And then we're going to return the given API response again, which is our error response. So this is saying that we get a 403, there's an error, 403, and this is the API response. So this is now correctly yielded, which means that the callback should be called, but it should be wrong now. Yep. So we're passing back stars with undefined because there's no body, but we actually expect an error response. Okay, so let's check if we get a response.status code. At the moment, we can just check for 403. In theory, you should probably check for different error conditions. There might be other error conditions from the GitHub API, but you have to check that. So in this case, we'll do a callback, and we're going to say success is false. We're going to do a status code, and we can use the response.status code. And then we can have our message. What do we call it? We call it error. And API is rate limited. Try again later. Later. There we go. Otherwise, so if we succeed, there is no error. Again, we need our other test to pass. So let's try that now. Oh, and it's failed, because I've done a typo. Limited. There we go. And the good thing about Mocha here is it's telling us the difference between the two errors. So what's expected is rate limited. What actually happened is limited, because I missed a T out. Let's try that. Perfect. All our tests pass. So there you've learnt about spies, you've learnt about stubs, you've learnt about stubbing the data for both your happy paths and your unhappy paths, and that should get you started with using Sinon. Right, I'll be back tomorrow with another video. This time we're going to simplify and automate our testing setup, make things a lot easier to get rid of a lot of the boilerplate code that we've keep cutting and pasting. So see you tomorrow for another video on JavaScript testing for beginners.